So, Dr. Legato, I really am pleased to be meeting with you and to have you share your information, your experience over a very long time. I followed your work, as you know, for many, many years. And for those that don't know you, you have a treat in store. Dr. Legato has really been a worldwide leader in the whole field of gender-specific medicine and healthcare. You founded and are the director of the Center or the Foundation for Gender-Specific Medicine, which I believe you started in 2006. Did I get that right?
Yes, the original program began at Columbia in 1997. And then when I founded it on my own, we transitioned to a private foundation.
So maybe you could tell us a bit about the history of the foundation and really how you became interested in gender-specific health and medicine long before anybody was thinking in those terms.
Oh, like everybody else in science, I was trained to think that studying men was not only a protection for women, which was necessary, and that male and female physiology was identical essentially, except in reproductive biology. But one day, a journalist came into my laboratory and said that the American Heart Association was interested in the course of coronary artery disease in women, which they felt was different from that in men. And I said, oh, coronary disease is coronary disease. And the journalist who started this interest in women and heart disease said to me, my mother died of coronary disease. I think her course was very different. And I think her treatment was less aggressive than it would have been, and that it would have been had she been a man. So we started the research. And at the end of the book that we wrote, The Female Heart, The Truth About Women and Coronary Disease, it created an uproar of interest. And it turns out that many of my colleagues had been considering this, but nobody had ever synthesized the view that perhaps the hearts of men and women were different. So struck with the difference in coronary disease and in fact, the normal physiology of the heart, I went to my chairman and I said, you know what? Since the hearts are different, I wonder if there are other organ systems that may in fact be different as well. And I'd like to start a program of investigation to see if that's correct. And his answer was characteristic for academic pursuits. He said, well, if you can find the funding, go right ahead. It was very interesting to me that one of the judges of this book, The Female Heart, for the American Heart Association, had collaborated to give us a prize for this book as the best book published for the lay public in the year that it came out. And he invited me to tea. His name was T. George Harris. He happened to have been the founder of Psychology Today, a very charming man. And he said, how would you like to be a consultant to Procter & Gamble for women's products? So I said, I have a better idea. You know how you get an inspiration on the spur of the moment? I said, I have a better idea. Why don't we propose a partnership between an academic institution, Columbia, and Procter & Gamble to investigate the science of the differences between men and women and the development of new products. I said, you don't have any idea whether I would perform effectively as an individual consultant, but I can tell you, if we can negotiate this first ever commercial partnership, we might have something that's not only a model for other institutions and the private sector, but for the health of people in general. So 2 years later, it happened. And that's how the partnership, which they insisted I call for women's health at Columbia, because women's health was the buzzword, that's how the partnership was formed. My chairman, who was a devoted supporter of this whole thing and got more and more excited as we went along, unfortunately left for Johns Hopkins. And I decided there was no real support, talking to the next chairman, for gender-specific medicine. So I moved the foundation to a private foundation. And frankly, it's been flourishing ever since. We fund scientists all over the world, and the science of gender-specific medicine is now an international discipline. We have fabulous meetings, and I'm going next week actually to give another keynote address on why gender-specific medicine is the way of the future. I might add that we're now interested in space travel, as you know, and fitting human beings for travel in space and for the colonization of extraterrestrial objects or planets is going to be very challenging, because the physiology of the male and female astronaut and extraplanetary civilization is very different. So we think this is an exciting new venture for my foundation and for the other foundations that are supporting this Congress. And I am very happy that in September, we'll be discussing this new frontier for gender medicine.
That's exciting. Well, I first became aware of your work when I read your book, Eve's Rib, The New Science of Gender-Specific Medicine and How It Can Save Your Life. And although, as you talked about, your initial focus, at least as was described, and you talk about the roots very well, were evolved towards women's health right from the beginning. And you said it right in the introduction to the book that this was not just a focus on the female. This was gender-specific medicine that impacted everybody.
It's a fight, Jed, that I've been fighting from 1997. And the reason we concentrated so much on women's health is we knew so little about women. And as you know, I worked with Vivian Pinn at the Office of Research on Women's Health for 4 years, establishing the program. And constantly, Vivian and I had to remind everyone that it was an important thing to fill the gap of ignorance about women's unique physiology, but that it was incredibly important to compare the two human populations, if you will, so that we could begin to ask, as we did, new questions. So that was an extremely important facet from the beginning of my concentration.
I saw that right from the beginning when I read that first book, and you wrote a number of books, but the one that really excited me with my background in focusing on the men's health side, because as you point out, back then and still to a large degree now, the men's side, the unique aspects of men's health had been neglected. And when I read your book, Why Men Die First, How to Lengthen Your Lifespan, with all the really talking to me and men, my father, my sons, all the men in my life, it was very exciting. And in that book, I was also struck by how personally you talked about your own background and about your own physician father and his early life and who he was and how that influenced you. And maybe you could share, if you will, a little bit about your father and what he and his life taught you, not only about your personal life, but about men and men's health.
Right. Well, my father was the quintessential 1940s male. He was ferociously dedicated to his vocation. He worked literally from 6 o'clock in the morning until midnight. I remember going down to breakfast one morning when I was a child, and he was sitting reading at 5 o'clock in the morning his hunting journals. He was an avid hunter. I said, Daddy, what are you up so early for? You don't have to be in the operating room until 8 o'clock. And he said, number one, this is my only private hour. And number two, don't ever disturb me again. Mm-hmm. He was supremely self-confident. He was a small town doctor who did everything from delivering babies to operating on pancreatic cancer. He had no fear of failing ever, as far as I knew. And he was also a profoundly important teacher. So his vitality was one of the things that really impressed me. The second thing that impressed me was he never complained. He never said, I'm tired, I'm discouraged, this or that failed. he was an ebullient physician. He loved what he did. He also was depressed. He would have bursts. I now realize that his bursts of anger and irritation, especially in the evening, were a function of depression that he never, God forbid, would discuss with anyone. He died as much of a lifestyle, which involved smoking, of bladder cancer, and typically of men, and this I never forgot. He had hematuria, blood in his urine, for 2 years before he agreed to be cystoscoped, and an inoperable cancer of the bladder was found that killed him. The last interview I ever had with my father was when he was literally on his deathbed, and one of my brothers had just given him some fentanyl. And he looked up, and as he always did, he never missed an opportunity to teach and be in command of the situation. He said, "Be very careful with that," he said to my brother, "because the absorption of a sedative by the mucous membranes can be very unpredictable," which I thought was classic. So my father's life was really, I should tell you about his war stories too. He was, like all men of his generation, a total daredevil. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge. His first act on reaching a new battlefield was to jump into the ambulance and drive it between the lines of the Americans and the Germans to see if they would respect the ambulance Red Cross. He once ordered a medic to go down a slope to retrieve a wounded soldier. The medic refused, and my father said, "I briefly considered shooting the medic, and then I decided to go myself." This was characteristic. He climbed down, retrieved the wounded soldier, and he got a Bronze Star. Also characteristically, he said, "Had my commanding officer been more verbal, I would have gotten a Silver Star for that, because it was really very hazardous." So my father was one of the first and most important factors in styling myself, essentially to keep complaining to a minimum, to persevere, to take on impossible tasks with the confidence that it was worth a try, and if I failed, I could try again. So that was the story of my father and me.
That's so touching, and it points out so many important things about men. I mean, those qualities are admirable. I think we don't want to throw out the admirable qualities with some of the dysfunctional or problematic parts of it. But it reminds me, one of my clients, a man, and not so atypical, similar to what he said, "Well, I know health is important. I get my annual medical exam once every 10 years. And I know you wrote in the book something that really struck me. Many things did, but you talked about male vulnerability as being part of the biological, physiological part of being male. He said the fundamental male biology makes you an underdog. Could you share a little bit about that reality, of the reality of males as underdogs?
The tragedy of men's health that I don't think we realize is that they are at a biological disadvantage from the moment of conception, literally, until old age because of their biology. But the response of society, the demands that we make of men, are very much different than the demands and expectations we make of women. And I can tell you that it's still true in 2023. There are differences in our expectations of what men should be or act like, and what women find appropriate in terms of their demeanor. We've struggled with it. There has been, yes, a feminist revolution, but I can tell you that the expectations of society for men and women still are different. So that combination of biology, which makes the problem for males to survive much more difficult from the moment of conception until old age, if they achieve it, by the way, and societal demands combine to make it a pretty dangerous thing, relatively speaking, to be male versus female, which is why the lifespan is 7 to 10 years longer in women. Just go to Florida and you'll see the ranks of women who have been widowed for a decade or more.
Well, I grew up with that reality, and my father was my early teacher, and my early experience was he, as a man who had become increasingly depressed at midlife, when he couldn't make a living to support his family, and I was the family that had come into the world. And so when my first son was born, I made a promise to him. He was born November 21st, 1969. And I made a promise that I would be a different kind of father than my father was able to be, and to do everything I could to create a world where men were fully healthy and fully engaged in their families throughout their lives. And a quote in your book about men just struck me. You said, "The premature death of men is the most important and neglected health issue of our time." I mean, that's a very, very profound and powerful statement from obviously somebody who's studied this. Could you say more about why you said that, and what your feeling is about what that means and what we can do perhaps to address that profound issue?
Well, I think the public should be aware of the vulnerability of the male from conception to, say, 30, when the first external, if you will, disease of coronary artery disease begins to defeat and kill men. Some of the things that I think we might teach the public is that the male fetus is at special risk, even in the womb. The mother's anxiety affects a male fetus more. His lungs are underdeveloped in terms of functionality, even at the time of birth. He's 4 to 6 times more likely not to survive birth and the postnatal period than his sisters. And one of the interesting factors, for example, that the public may not be aware of, is that girls, during the stress of delivery and issuing from the womb, can increase their heart rates and their cardiac output to equip them for the struggle of birth. Boys don't have that reflex ability to increase their heart rates to the degree that girls do. Postnatally, they are 4 to 6 times, probably relative to the fact that they can't keep up their heart rates to cope with the blood supply that's needed by their large brains. They're 4 to 6 times more likely to have developmental disabilities than are their sisters. We know that the development of the cortical features of governing reflex impulse responses is delayed in men until they're 20 to 21. And therefore, they're much more likely to make reckless decisions as adolescents than their sisters, which is very important. You'd also be, I think, quite stricken to hear the statistic that 6% of deaths of boys between birth and 6 years of age is due to murder. Were you aware of that?
Unfortunately, I was and am, and that continues to go on, as you know.
Exactly. So a concentration on more focused therapy for the in utero child, a male, by the parents, by the preparation for pregnancy. If it is a male that's conceived, I think it would be useful for parents, and their pediatricians are aware of this, obstetricians, but for parents to try to protect the mother from stress, to prepare for pregnancy with adequate nutrition, and at the moment of birth, to be prepared to be especially vigilant about these relatively more delicate boys compared to their sisters. The early incidence of coronary disease at the age of 30, when coronary disease becomes the chief killer of men, is something that really, really demands extra attention. Some of it is biology, but as you know, I've said many times, some of it is sociology and the demands that we make on men that encourage them to neglect symptoms, to pursue lifestyles that are extremely reckless, including smoking, drinking, lack of exercise, obesity, poor treatment for hypertension. That should be an area of special concentration. Why women are protected is, again, one of the beauties of studying the two sexes in parallel. What protects women? Is it just estrogen? I'm not sure. I think there are sociologic factors that protect women as well, although clearly biological factors are involved. The cancers that afflict men are not just prostate cancer. You know, men are no different than women. They concentrate on reproduction, as do women, as the most important things in the world. Women had believed for a long time that breast cancer was their chief and only fatal enemy, practically speaking. And men come in and talk about prostate cancer as though there's no other organ in the body. But in fact, lung cancer kills more men than any other cancer. So I think that we have to reconfigure the way we look at the great arc of men's lives and understand through the new science of epigenetics and how epigenetic factors code gene expression to react to the environment is an extremely important advance. And so correcting the social factors that put men at risk and helping men to create hardier, more resistant to fatal disease bodies is an extremely important new discipline, which is the study of epigenetics and how the environment impacts gene expression in both sexes.
Well, it's so important, and what you just said about men, it reminded me of a cartoon I saw years and years ago, and it's a male and female sitting across from each other, and they're engaged in somewhat heated discussion, and the woman reaches up and has a fork in her hand, and she stabs the man in his nose with the fork, and he just is totally calm, didn't hurt him. And the caption under it is, she says to him, "That's what I love about you, Louis, you're tough."
Right.
And I think that attitude that you talk about your father, about the social attitudes that tell us men are tough, they're invulnerable, they're the strong sex. And what you're recognizing, and obviously from science and experience, that men in fact are not the tough sex, we're the vulnerable sex. And maybe part of our toughness is our fear of acknowledging our vulnerability. And you so clearly speak to that issue. And I'm wondering just if you could talk, you talked about this meld between the biological and the social, the physiological and the relational. And I wonder if you could talk about these two terms of sex differences and gender differences. And many people that I talk to talk about them as though they were totally different realms, like apples and oranges, but they're intimately related as you describe them.
Right. As you know, Jed, we published now the fourth edition is about to come out of the Principles of Gender-Specific Medicine. And one of the important features of the post-genomic era, which means the time since we've learned to decode our DNA and look at the molecular biology of sex, is that we understand that there is an adaptive mechanism of genes to respond appropriately to the environment from the time we're conceived. And that's achieved through small molecular changes in the gene apparatus, which doesn't change the gene sequence, but modifies gene expression in response to an environmental signal. So sex and gender become one, not two separate issues. And the best way to sum it up is that we do have an architecture that's indestructible and remains constant, our DNA, but we can modify the way those genes work in response to our experience. From the very moment we're conceived, this goes on. This has been the great insight of the post-genomic era, and it makes the separation between, quote, biology and which is called sex, and gender, which is called the total of the human, which is a consequence of biology and environment. It's one concept. And I have spent a lot of time trying to think of a word that would eliminate the difference between sex and gender. And if you read any paper, even published yesterday, the author still labors to go into a special paragraph about what's the difference between sex and gender. And my answer is no difference. Same concept, two components, united by the biology of what we now call epigenetics, which is how we modify genes to respond to the world we live in.
That's so profound, and it's so hopeful, because I think part of the problem with the neglect of men's health is that we assume, okay, well, if there are these differences, that's just kind of the way men are, and it's our fault. If we want to be crazy and do crazy stuff and drink too much and take great risks, well, that's just men. And there isn't really anything you can do about it, because that's just the way we are. And this whole idea says, no, these changes can be modified, and there's a lot men can do to change that story.
Exactly. That's how we change behavior. So it's a great new idea. We just finished a very important seminar that we're about to publish called Sex Epigenetics from the Molecule to the Bedside. And I'll send you a copy, Jed, as soon as I hold it in my hand. But the epigenetic era has been one of the most exciting, because it's how we modify behavior, how we create memories, how experience benefits us, and we are certainly able to change, as you point out. It's not such a desolate prediction of what we're going to be. There is one thing I'd like to mention, Jed, if I could.
Sure.
In this world of high tech, the need for men to be strong, muscular, physically more competent characters than women has been eroded to a great extent. And so men's emphasis on sports, physical fitness, which is all based on how competent they are as muscular, powerful individuals, is receding in importance. And I think it's one of the things that should enter into the discussion about football injuries, if I may say so. Men are adjusting to the fact that physical fitness and prowess may not be important as civilization continues to evolve and we have robots to do the heavy lifting, for example. That's going to be a huge environmental change. And it will be fascinating, to me anyway, to see how men respond to this new set of what's important in civilization and for success in civilization.
Well, I agree, and I have a personal connection with that whole process. I have 5 children, 17 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren, and 2 of my grandsons are twins, and their father's always been interested in sports. They've been interested in sports since they were born, and I held them in my each hand, these 2 twin little baby boys. They grew up to play football, and they were very good at it, and they were big enough to play at the highest level. Their dream was to play in the National Football League. Unlike most people who have those kind of dreams, they achieved it, and they were drafted out of college by the New England Patriots. And they played for the Patriots for 2 years, and they're still in the National Football League. They are on different teams now, but I have this very mixed emotion about it, because on the one hand, these guys have achieved their childhood dream to be a football player at that level. And I know very well, more than most, the dangers of head injuries, and obviously more of us are. What they've been able to do, and I think this is one of the hopes for the future, is from the beginning, they have balanced that strong macho with a very gentle feeling, emotional ability to get in touch. And they're looking forward to the time when they're no longer have a job being a football player and can expand their being in the world. So I think this is changing. And I think I've been in a men's group now myself for 44 years, that I've been meeting with a small group of men. And my wife, Carlin, says one of the reasons she believes that we have had a very successful 43-year marriage is because I've been in a men's group for 44 years. So I think that trend is continuing and is going to affect more people as we continue on.
Because we're in New York City, you may hear the sounds of the jackhammer. I hope that isn't disturbing your recording.
Not at all. It's the sounds of life.
Right, exactly.
So speaking
of, I watch those men with the jackhammers. There are no women.
Exactly.
They have this constant vibration of this powerful thing. I check to see, as I pass by, how many of them are wearing earplugs. Only half are. And I think to myself, boys, you're going to be in trouble sooner than you think with carpal tunnel, joint problems, and loss of hearing, an occupational hazard.
Exactly. And I want to just kind of underline what you just said. And there was a study that was done probably 20 years ago now by a number of colleagues that I knew, a guy named Randall Nesse, who's an MD, and they studied cultures throughout the world on longevity. And they found, as you well know, that in every country they studied, that women not only outlived males as a group, but also men suffered from major diseases at higher levels. And they made two really powerful conclusions that even 20 years ago for me at Men Alive was a call to action. They said that if you could just help men live as long and healthy as women, you would save 375,000 men's lives every year in the United States alone.
Wow.
And their conclusion was that if you could do that, you would do more good in the world than curing cancer. Big deal. So part of what we've done over the years from then was to orient Men Alive and the work we do at our center to really look at what are the things we can change that would improve men. And last year we brought together some of the experts that I've worked with over the years, and we started what we call our Moonshot for Mankind and Humanity, which is I hope to be an international program to bring together experts, programs in the world that are doing this work and really put the energy and the focus on men's health, not just for the men, but as you point out, that women are vitally involved in wanting men to live healthy and productive lives. So
along those lines, I think we should comment, you and I, about the decrease in male fertility, which has been profound and true in every country that was studied.
Indeed.
Italy, 70% problem, United States, 50% decline in male fertility. And I have been interested in developing a simple compound for men which would protect them against some of the insults in the environment that create defective sperm. So I think one area we should be concentrating on is not only are men at risk, but they're becoming less productive in terms of viable sperm to an alarming extent. And that should be a focus of investigation. We do love and need men, I have to say.
Well, indeed.
It behooves us to do everything we can to protect them, but also to ensure that they're still around, to keep us company, if you will, as long as possible.
Well, bravo. And I think most everybody would agree with that, although I think there's a narrative among some people, some women, that the world would be better off if we just get rid of the men. And I think we don't really mean that, but the feeling is that, well, I'll give you a little quote. There's a comedian named Elaine Boozler that I think captured some of the differences in a humorous way, but I think has some accuracy. She said that when women get depressed, they either eat or go shopping. Men invade another country. It's a whole different way of thinking. And I think this narrative needs to change, that men are somehow inherently violent.
Have we been watching the women in Congress? Do they wield power with any more compassion, empathy, or discretion than men?
Exactly.
This old fairy tale that if women ruled the world, it would all be peaceful. I just think people ought to watch the daily news for the performance of some of the women who are more violent, more vicious, and more reckless than any of the men with whom it consort.
Exactly.
More powerful, by the way, more compelling, more charismatic about leadership into violent responses to the world around them. Very, very important.
Well, I want to obviously stay in touch with you on many things, but if there was one thing that would get men to pay attention to their health, reminding them of the assaults on their sexuality, generally men will wake up for a lot of things, and that would be one that anything that would help that would be a boon to mankind and humanity, and would speak volumes to the value that we want to project into the world. Well, let me, there are two more areas that I wanted to explore with you. One is, again, back to our fathers. As I mentioned, my father had a breakdown when I was 5 years old, became depressed and suicidal. And I really grew up wondering what happened to my father. He took an overdose of pills. He didn't die, but he was committed to a state mental hospital where he didn't get better. In fact, he got worse. But male depression, I grew up with, wanting to understand as much as I could. I eventually went back to school, got a PhD in international health, and studied the differences between male and female depression and how that manifested. Found it was a similar dynamic to heart disease, that we had focused heart disease more on, well, this is what heart disease is because we saw it more in men. I think we had certain assumptions about depression because we tended to see it more in women, but depression, I think, is widespread, more widespread than we have understood. And I know you've written and talked about depression and some of the differences that we've seen between male and female depression. Could you speak a little about that from your experience?
First of all, there are incredible gender differences between men and women in terms of the incidence of the types of mental diseases, schizophrenia being more common in men, for example. Depression in women has always been easier to diagnose because women are more likely to talk about their symptoms or somatize them, come in with symptoms that have no organic basis, which may indicate that they're depressed. And they're also more likely to ask for help. They are quiet, reserved, and retiring often, rather than reaching out. And the isolated woman who seeks help and talks about her symptoms is kind of the cameo of female depression. Men refuse to admit weakness. Depression is a sign of weakness. Seeing a psychiatrist is anathema to ask for help about mental weakness. It will go on my record, it will affect my career, etc. And so all of the manifestations of depression in male and female are quite different. And I think the trick in looking at men is to see if there's been a change, for example, in drinking, in reckless activity, in either more vigorous pursuit of sexual encounters or retreat from sexual encounters. They're sort of signals that point us to look at whether depression is a factor in men. that we don't need so much, if you will, in treating or diagnosing and treating depression in women.
Well, more and more work needs to be done, obviously, in this area. I'd ask you one, just somewhat selfishly, but after reading your book about men and your statement about the importance of men's health, are you planning another book on men, or is there any work that you're doing that would focus, I know, beyond all the things you're doing, anything in the works around men's
I
health?
think there'll be a very important opportunity, if I have the time to do it, to look at the difference in equipping men and women for space travel and for colonization of extra Earth settlements, because the requirements and the way we prepare the two genders is going to be, I think, very, very interesting. So if I were to write another book, I would take that tack because everybody is dying to leave this, I think, great planet, which we should be concentrating on saving, to go to these ideal communities that they think promise a brighter future. It's not going to be that simple. But this preparation of people for space travel is going to be a whole new field to harvest important insights into how to make humans more fit and to extend their lifespan. So that might be another book. Thank you for the suggestion.
Well, I hope so. And you touch on these two issues, this idea that we're developing of a moonshot mission for mankind was the idea that, going to the moon was a big deal. Space travel is a big, in the news. And as you say, many people are wanting somehow to get away from what seems like the stresses and the inability of our government and any decision-making bodies to make changes. But I think, as you say, this is a wonderful and maybe our ultimate home. And at least for now, this is where we want to be. So how can we have that kind of moonshot idea of making the earth a better place? And what place could men's health perhaps be a central part of that dialogue? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think, as one of the astronauts said on one of the first moon shots, he looked back and he said, it will be wonderful to return for what he described as the good green earth. And I think that to concentrate on the health of humans, using the information we're going to cull from our work with the space traveler, to improve human competence and the environment of the earth for humans from the new knowledge that we're getting will be a big opportunity. I think it's important not to psychologically abandon the hope that the earth will not survive. And I think to turn all of our, or at least a major part of our efforts to maintaining the environment that we have been gifted with on the earth is equally important, as is the space philosophy, which basically in many ways is a myth, that it will be easier, better, that we will not be violent, rapacious, warlike peoples in settlements on other planets. It's going to be the same pathology, in my opinion. But the space population does not agree with me and is far more hopeful that there will be better worlds to come. I'm not so sure. So I'd like to concentrate on making this good green earth a safer and richer environment for all the creatures that live on this planet. This one.
Well, here. Let us wrap up with those thoughts and those words, and let's definitely stay in touch. I'd love to talk with you again sometime and share information about this and hopefully work together towards that goal. You and I and many others that have been doing this work for years, and your work in gender specific healthcare and medicine, I think, really points the way to these and an opportunity not only for health between men and women, but health for our whole planetary home here on planet Earth.
Yes. It's lovely to speak with you, Jed. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.